Today we're going to dive into a really fascinating and, you'll see, an incredibly consistent way of looking at the world. It's a philosophy that tries to explain all human rights, every single one of them, through just one idea, the concept of property. It's all built on a single, simple rule that when you apply it everywhere leads to some pretty radical conclusions about how things should work. So let's get into it.
All right, let's start with a classic. You've heard this one a million times, right? It's the go-to example for why rights, especially free speech, have to have limits. The famous line is that you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater. But what if that's the wrong way to think about the problem entirely? The philosophy we're exploring today says the answer isn't about limiting rights at all. It's about seeing the whole situation through a totally different lens, one that's based on that single unbending principle I mentioned.
So, where does this all start? Well, it all boils down to one foundational rule. Just one. It's the bedrock for the entire philosophy. It's called the non-aggression axiom. And according to the source material, every single thing we're about to talk about, no matter how wild it sounds, is just a logical consequence of this one big idea. You could almost think of it as the source code for this entire worldview.
And there it is, the non-aggression axiom. Now, the most important word here, the word everything hinges on, is initiate. This rule doesn't say you can never use violence. If someone attacks you, defending yourself is perfectly fine. What it forbids is starting it. You can't be the one to throw the first punch, metaphorically or literally. You can't be the aggressor against another person or their property. In this way of thinking, aggression is basically just invasion, crossing a boundary without permission.
Okay, so what happens when you take that one rule and just apply it consistently? Well, the implications are huge. It leads to a rock-solid defense of things like free speech and free assembly, because, hey, those are peaceful. It also means you've got to oppose any laws against so-called victimless crimes. The logic is simple. If no one's person or property was harmed, what's the crime? And then, this is where it gets really provocative. It leads to some very stark conclusions about what governments do. Conscription? That's seen as slavery. And modern warfare, with all its collateral damage, that's defined as mass murder.
So if we have this rule against aggression, where do we start applying it? Well, logically, it has to begin with the very first piece of property anyone ever has, the one thing we're all born with, ownership of our own bodies. This is the absolute ground floor of the whole building. The idea is that every single person has an absolute and universal right to own themselves. That means you, and only you, get to decide what happens to your body, your labor, your life. This isn't some privilege that a government gives you and can take back. It's a natural right you have just because you're a human being.
Now, the source material argues that when you boil it down, there are really only three possibilities for who owns people. First, there's self-ownership, what we just talked about. Second, you could have one class of people owning another class, which is just slavery, and this philosophy rejects that out of hand. Then there's the third option, communal ownership. This is the idea that we all own a tiny, equal share of everybody else. But this is seen as completely unworkable. I mean, imagine having to get permission from all 8 billion of your co-owners just to decide what to eat for breakfast. Total paralysis, right?
Okay, so I own me, you own you. That seems straightforward enough. But how does that extend to owning things? Stuff in the outside world. How do you get from owning your body to rightfully owning a piece of land or the phone in your hand? This is a huge question, and the philosophy has a very direct path to the answer.
And for that answer, we turn to the legendary thinker John Locke. He's the one who built the bridge between owning yourself and owning things. His insight was simple but profound. If you own your body, then you must also own your labor, the energy, the effort, the work that your body does. The work of your hands is basically an extension of yourself.
So here's how that works in practice. This is often called homesteading. You start with something in nature that nobody owns or uses, some wild land, some clay in the ground. Then a person comes along and mixes their labor with it. They clear the land and plant a garden. They dig up the clay and shape it into a pot. By taking their labor, which they own, and mixing it with an unowned resource, they transform it, and that transformed thing becomes their private property.
What this means is that the person who first creates something of value from a raw resource, the farmer, the inventor, the artist, they have the strongest moral claim to owning it. The source puts it like this: who else could possibly have a better claim? Some other person who's never even seen it, let alone put in the work? It just doesn't follow.
All right, so now we're getting to the real core of it, where this whole framework kind of flips everything on its head. This philosophy isn't just about defining property. It's about redefining what we even mean when we say the word rights.
It basically challenges the way we all talk about human rights.
Think about how we usually talk. There are human rights, like freedom of speech, that sound really noble and important. And then there are property rights, which can sound kind of greedy or materialistic. We act like they're two totally different things, and that human rights are obviously superior. Well, this philosophy argues that distinction is totally false.
And here is the central, most mind-bending claim. There is no difference. All human rights are property rights. They're not two separate categories. Think about the most basic human right of all, the right to life. What does that even mean if you don't have the right to own the food you need to stay alive, or the shelter you need to survive? You can't separate them.
Let's make it super practical. What is freedom of speech in the real world? It's the property right to rent a stage, or own a microphone, or buy a domain name. Freedom of the press? That's just an empty slogan if you don't have the property right to buy a printing press and some ink. You see the pattern? Every abstract right, when you bring it down to earth, is really about your right to own and control physical stuff.
Which, of course, brings us all the way back to where we started, the crowded theater. Now that we have this property-based framework, how do we solve that old riddle? Let's stop thinking about it as a free speech problem and start looking at it as a property rights problem. Using this framework, the problem gets pretty clear. Let's look at two possibilities. Scenario 1, the guy who shouts fire is the owner of the theater. Well, he just committed fraud. His customers gave him their property, their money, in exchange for a safe, peaceful movie, and he created a dangerous panic instead. He broke the contract. Scenario 2, the shouter is just a customer with a ticket. Well, in that case, he's violating the property rights of the owner by disrupting his business, and he's violating the property rights of every other person in the audience to enjoy the show they paid for.
So, the final conclusion is pretty neat. The shouter isn't a criminal because free speech has limits. He's a criminal because he aggressively violated the clear property rights of other people. From this perspective, you don't need to create messy exceptions to our fundamental rights. The problem isn't the speech, the problem is the aggression against property.
Okay, so let's zoom out one last time. Let's see how this whole property-focused worldview defines freedom itself and what it says about, well, the biggest player in the game, the state.
So what is freedom? According to this philosophy, it's not some vague, fuzzy feeling. It's a very specific condition you can actually observe. Freedom is the state of being where no one is initiating violence against you or your stuff. Period. Freedom is simply the absence of aggression.
And if that's freedom, then the definition of a crime is just as simple. It's the exact opposite. A crime is any act of aggression against someone's property rights. It doesn't matter if it's their physical body or their physical objects. Assaulting someone violates their self-ownership. Stealing from them violates their material ownership. It's all the same fundamental offense.
And this is where the really meets the road. This is what happens when you apply that non-aggression rule consistently, without making any special exceptions for the government. The source material argues that if it's wrong for you or me to take someone's money, it's also wrong for a group of people to do it, even if they call it taxation. If it's wrong to force someone to work for you, it's still wrong when it's called conscription. The names change, but from this perspective, taxation is theft, conscription is slavery, and war is mass murder. They're shocking terms, but they follow directly from that one simple axiom.
Now, what's underneath all of this is a really intense focus on the individual. The argument is that we make a huge mistake when we talk about things like society, or the community, or the nation, as if they're real entities that can think, can feel, and have rights. This philosophy says, no, those are just words. They're just labels for a bunch of individuals interacting. There is no hive mind. There's just people.
The writer Frank Chodorov summed it all up perfectly with 3 grammatically strange words: society are people. It's designed to make you stop and think. It's a reminder that every time we hear that society needs something or the nation demands something, what it always means is that some people want to do something to other people. And this perspective argues that hiding individuals behind those big collective nouns is how the violation of rights has been justified for pretty much all of human history. Thanks for tuning in.